So first I'll introduce myself and the panelists, and I'm really excited for this panel today. So my name is Seth Reisner. I'm a 6th-year student in the MD PhD program at Vanderbilt University, and I'm really excited to moderate this panel today because these sorts of interdisciplinary collaborations are exactly why I chose to complete combined MD PhD training and why I still get excited about this training path today. And so this panel of investigators will share tips and tricks for how they've successfully formed collaborations between MDs and PhDs. And while the title of the panel mentions these two specific degrees, the MD and the PhD, I want to acknowledge that there are many types of clinicians who conduct research: nurses, nurse practitioners, psychologists, etc. And our CAIRIBU group includes many clinicians, scientists who are not MDs. And so I'd just like to make the point that broadly, what we're really talking about is collaborations across the spectrum of biomedical research between clinician researchers and basic scientists with the ultimate goal of advancing translational research. And so I hope that what we're talking about today will be more broad than just MDs and PhDs specifically. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce the panelists and then we'll get into the discussion. So first, Dr. Maria Hadjifrangiskou is an associate professor of pathology, microbiology and immunology, and associate professor in urology at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Her lab, where I'm a student, studies the bacterial pathogenesis of urinary tract infections with a particular focus on bacterial signaling and metabolism. And I'm a little bit biased because I'm in her lab, but I think she does a great job of forming collaborations between clinicians and basic scientists. And that's a huge reason why I joined her lab 4 or 5 years ago now. Dr. Lindsey Burnett is an assistant professor in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology and Reproductive Sciences at University of California, San Diego. Clinically, she specializes in the treatment of pelvic floor disorders, and her research focuses on urodynamics, the urobiome, and recurrent urinary tract infections. Dr. Douglas Strand is an associate professor in the Department of Urology at UT-Southwestern, and his research focuses on BPH and LUTS, and he's pioneered tissue repositories for collecting and studying urologic samples. And finally, Dr. John Knight is an associate professor in the Department of Urology at University of Alabama at Birmingham, and his research focus is kidney stone disease, with a focus on oxalate stones and oxalate metabolism. So I think the way that we'll handle the rest of the panel is by having, I'll ask a first question, and then maybe we can hear from all the panelists for a few minutes, and then any follow-up questions from members of the audience, or I have some follow-up questions as well. So the first question I'd like to ask is if all of our panelists could describe some of their recent collaborations between clinicians and basic scientists and emphasize how you've initiated those collaborations, how to reach out, and what aspects of those collaborations were particularly successful. And maybe we'll start in the order that I introduced panelists, so starting with Dr. Hadjifrangiskou.
First off, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the introduction, Seth. So one of our most recent collaborations is with the Department of Urology, specifically the Division of Pediatric Urology here at Vanderbilt, where we undertook the identification of the infant male urobiome. And that's a study that actually involved Seth and also involved a pediatric urology fellow who has a protected 1-year time. So one of the things that I really, really want to emphasize here is like, it can be daunting to start a collaboration, but don't be afraid to sort of reach across that bridge and meet the other discipline halfway. So one of the things that worked well for us was to initiate attending lab meetings for each other. So like I attended rounds with pediatric urology. I got to know the individuals. And then conversely, we have pediatric urology fellows attending our lab meetings. And that has really allowed us to learn each other's language. So we don't use as much bacteriology jargon that we would usually do. And they also help us really navigate the terminology typically used in the clinic. So I think getting the communication and the investment by using a person from each side really, really fosters a good long-standing collaboration. So you don't only have to establish it, but also you have to maintain it.
And Dr. Burnett, if you could share some reflections.
Building off of that, I totally agree. It's kind of being in each other's spaces and learning about their world, right? And so lab meetings, seminars, sometimes whatever different things, being willing to talk about your research with people that you might think have no interest, but you have more in common or more overlap between ideas than you realize. I mean, I remember when I was in graduate school going to a seminar over in astronomy, and the software that they were using for galaxy mapping, I later used to map like sperm trajectories for my own sperm chemotaxis work. So these very, very bizarre things that you never know where the next connection or useful resource is going to pop up in. I mean, think about things like GFP that was discovered in like sea creatures and, you know, modified for work. Like there's things we use all the time that came from the strangest places possible. More recently, I'm more on the clinical side and recently started sort of my own lab, but my work has spanned both clinical practice and research, and then now is becoming more translational. And for me, it's reaching out to the people with expertise in the areas that I don't know as much about. Things like, at least for me recently, has been urinary metabolomics and microbiome. And they know more about some of the details for that and how to run samples. And I know more about the clinical practice of recurrent urinary tract infection and how those things might intersect. And I have a huge crush on all of Maria's work. Because I have a really, really soft spot in my heart for mitochondrial function and study it both in terms of pelvic floor muscle physiology. And now I'm veering into how impaired host cell mitochondrial function might influence recurrent UTI susceptibility, because in clinical populations, we know that women that have probably impaired mitochondrial function, either be via menopause or via diet-induced obesity or recurrent or diabetes and these kinds of things, also have susceptibility to recurrent UTI. So I think there's even more out there to be done if we just talk to one another and think about what things are really a problem on the clinical side and how they could be solved on the research side. And I actually did my MD PhD the ridiculously long way. I did my PhD in molecular and cellular biology and a postdoc in physiology and biophysics, and then really felt so passionately that people should be able to speak both of these languages that I then went back to medical school and did residency and fellowship in Urogyn. So I feel maybe not like the best I could be in either of those fields, since I kind of split the gap, but there's something very useful about finding people like me that speak both languages semi-fluently to be able to communicate and interface between MDs and PhDs. So I would say the other thing is it's nice to have someone that's Seth, you're going to be in an enviable position because you'll be able to translate both, even though you might not feel like the best PhD all the days and you might not feel like the best MD all the days, but being in that position to translate is important, and having a translator involved is also important sometimes.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. Dr. Strand.
I'll speak specifically to my experience in a department of urology, which I joined about 9 years ago after my training at Vanderbilt. And I first got my exposure to human tissue research while I was at Vanderbilt as a postdoc, working in the Department of Urology. And I noticed as soon as I started my faculty position here at UT-Southwestern that the surgeons that I worked with were very much interested in getting involved in research. So probably the most important point that I learned about working with surgeons is that they're extremely busy. So you have to be the one that is flexible. So I would say always be on time, even if the surgeon is not. Always be available, even if the surgeon is not. Be very specific. I have a 3-line rule in emails. If it takes more than 3 lines, then they're not going to read it. So there are like these little rules that you kind of have to follow for dealing with surgeons, but it can be incredibly transactional. I don't mean that in a negative way, where you get what you want, which for me was human tissue, and they get what they want, which for them is abstracts for the AUA and their name on publications. And this is especially important for younger faculty. So what I learned in the 10 years I've been here in this department is that the more experienced surgeons really don't need as much from you as the younger surgeons do. The younger surgeons need tenure, which means that they need to be productive. So I really focused on my interactions with them, and I tried to be there at grand rounds and be there at the AUA and be there at residency graduation, et cetera. And, you know, not try to push specific conversations, but try to clue them into what I was interested in and what they were interested in. And not all of those interactions resulted in a collaboration, but there were some really key ones that came out of those discussions. And now on a weekly basis, I go out to lunch with the surgeons in my group. We talk about our kids and baseball and science and whatever, right? But now it's kind of, you know, turned into more of a friendship than a transaction. But I include all of them on my publications. I write abstracts for them, et cetera. I've been on the committee for their tenure promotion for several of the younger surgeons in the group. So this has turned into my laboratory specifically just doing human tissue research. So I work with transplant surgeons, I work with urologic surgeons to get disease tissue, the transplant surgeons to get normal tissue, and any publications that come out of that, I put them on there. So now I get surgeons that come to me and come sit in my office and say, how can I help? Because they know that they're going to get publications and tenure, et cetera, from helping out. So it's been a really, really fruitful collaboration. But I would say on the PhD side of things that you need to do the legwork. Do not leave it up to the surgeons. Make sure that you take care of everything if you want it done. So I guess that's my 2 cents.
And then as a surgeon, if what you want is in the title of the email in capitals, it helps a lot. If it's like, please sign, please edit, please whatever, then we can immediately triage. And if you don't hear from us, it's not because we don't care or we hate you. It's because we got 15,000 emails in the interval. Please reach out again, text us again. If you keep on us, we will do it. I promise. It's just going to take a little time.
Those are some great points about managing workload and the collaborative relationship. And I think we can come back to some of those in follow-up questions. So Dr. Knight, any opening words?
Thanks for putting me last, Seth, because I think most of the things that I was going to say are really just reflects, particularly what Doug said. You know, I work in the Department of Urology. I've been doing kidney stone research for 20 years, and my longevity is really down to the collaborations I've had, primarily with surgeon scientists. And I just want to reiterate what Doug said. You really have to do the legwork, the nuts and bolts, the IRB applications, the iCook applications, managing the staff, and those types of things. And I think the other point I'd like to reiterate that Doug said is you have to work to their schedule. So you've got to be prepared to come in at 6 a.m., come in at the weekends if the meeting is that important, just to keep them abreast of everything. I think that's really important to lead that communication of how the research is going, and just to set those responsibilities early on about what you expect from that collaboration. The only other point I was going to make is I've been somewhat fortunate in that my chair is very research friendly. You know, one of the challenges working as a PhD in a clinical department, or even a surgeon wanting to do research, is you need protected time and you need your salary covered to a certain degree. And that can vary across the board. Some departments need you to cover, you know, 90% of your salary from extramural funds. But my chair was friendly and I wasn't put under that type of pressure. And that, I think, helped me form relationships with surgeons who were given that protected research time by our chair. Obviously, if there's endowment in the department, that can facilitate that protected time. And then the other thing that has really helped me in my career is, again, because my primary mentor was a surgeon scientist and also the chair, he attracted, young faculty that were very interested in research, very talented. So the group I work in, there's one MD PhD and 2 surgeon scientists, all with K awards. And we all work in the same office area. And so when you have that closeness and you're all with each other almost daily, that creates a lot of opportunities. And what's really benefited our research is I've been able to go into other areas. So that resonated with me, Seth, about it's not just the MDs that you need to collaborate with translational research. In our field, you need to be talking to dietitians, nurse practitioners to help with recruitment, and having young faculty that are really wanting to progress in their careers really helps create new relationships. And we recently have initiated a collaboration with hepatology because we're interested in how liver metabolism, particularly in the setting of fatty liver, might change the risk of kidney stone disease. That would have never happened if I wasn't collaborating with young K awardees who were reaching out to other K awardees in other departments. So that was really the only other thing I wanted to add.
That's great. And I might ask a follow-up question while we're kind of thinking about workload and these collaborative partnerships. Thinking about how have you balanced workload in research partnerships between clinicians and full-time research faculty when the clinicians have clinical effort that they're having to do? And so this is something that I think both Dr. Strand and Dr. Knight just talked about, but any other thoughts on that, how to balance workload, or even thinking about when you're applying for a grant and asking for certain amounts of effort in the grant? How have you all navigated some of that?
Well, I guess I can go first. I think, yes, on the grant funding, it's absolutely critical. So if I put a grant in, you do need to have that discussion early on. And if you put them down at 20%, don't expect them to do 20% effort. But again, it's just trying to facilitate them to have protected time. So it's a good point, Seth. You have to try and include them in any grant that you're putting in and make sure you have effort that they're happy with. I think that's an excellent point.
Yeah, I would say, at least with the surgeons that I work with, I don't think it'll ever happen that they'll be able to give 20% effort. Most of the time, they're talking about 1 to 3%. And again, you're going to be lucky to get the 1 to 3%, but that 1% that they give you is transformative for your research. So take what you can get. I just wouldn't expect much more than that. Just reiterating what John was saying. You're going to get that 1-2 meetings a year, probably some face-to-face time at grand rounds or something like that, just to give a quick 30-second, 1-minute update on progress, et cetera. And then, maybe some back and forth when you're submitting publications, et cetera. But most of the time, the collaborations that we set up are facilitated by other people in the department, like nurses, pathology, et cetera. But you need that surgeon to make sure that that everybody follows through on the things that that you need for your collaboration.
And I can tell you, as a surgeon scientist, it's tricky because part of our salary is is usually derivative of our clinical productivity, and part of our salary is derivative from our grants. So for me, I have a K award, so part of my salary comes from that, and then I have clinical activity that's the rest of it. So the more we're on grants or have other things, it kind of buys out our clinical responsibilities and makes us more available to do research, if that makes sense. And as surgeon scientists, we're not afforded some of the common things that, I don't know how to say it, regular scientists is the wrong word, but PhD only scientists are traditionally afforded. Things like FTEs within our department, space for our labs, startup costs and things like that. So for me, it's been quite a struggle because I'm neither considered a real scientist nor a real surgeon. So I don't necessarily have the RVU compensation, like for my clinical productivity, that my straight clinical colleagues have because I'm a scientist. And I don't have the same lab space, startup, FTE protection that a real scientist does because I'm a clinician. So realize that sometimes people like me are getting kind of the short ends of both sticks. So things that help with support on either side can be helpful. And, you know, many of us that are research-oriented, clinically active faculty are navigating these muddy waters of how to do our research in a meaningful way and juggle clinical responsibilities at the same time. So it can be very challenging to run a lab, have personnel in your lab, get experiments done in your lab, and see patients in clinic kind of all at the same time and or operate, you know? So for me, I'm usually in clinic 1 day a week and in the OR 1 to 2 days every 2 weeks. It kind of depends. It's usually, and it gets to be crazy in my lab. So I'm in there nights and weekends before cases and things like that, doing things on my own. And then my students are in there when I'm in there, and then I set them loose on the days where I'm doing other things. But without the sort of infrastructure that traditional PhDs get, it can be very challenging. So realize that we don't mean to be not available. We just have lots of other things going on, and any support on grants just helps buy out our clinical time so that we can make more time to be more involved in research and do the kinds of really excellent translational work that needs to be done.
And go ahead, John.
Just very quickly, Mayor, just to follow on from what Lindsey said, when we started this, or were attempting to start a new collaboration with hepatology, the initial person we met was very, very busy clinically. And one thing I really appreciated early on was they introduced us to a K awardee in the hepatology department who had 75% protected time. And that changed everything by being introduced to somebody else in the department who the chair had already given protected time. And that's really accelerated this new line of research. But it's tough. It's really tough getting protected time. I understand.
Yeah, and speaking as a straight PhD with no prior experience in dealing with the clinical side prior to coming to Vanderbilt, I need to emphasize that, you know, us PhDs tend to be procrastinators, are putting things in, but when you forge the collaboration with a clinician or the surgeon scientist, it is very important to outline the goals, just like what Doug said with this 3-line, you know, to-dos, but then have them ahead of time so that there can be enough time afforded to complete the paperwork, to complete what you need to submit a grant. And for us, again, we were lucky because at Vandy, the pediatric urology surgery fellows have 1 year of protected research time, and those folks have now become our conduit. At first, it was a little like cobbled together, but then we you know, as time went by, we started forging what has now become a sort of like blueprint of what they do, and they come and they spend all their time almost in our lab, and that they have become that connection that we need that allows us to do things on time, stay ahead of schedules, and manage that workload.
Those are some great points from everyone. Anyone in any of the participants, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll just keep asking questions, but I'd love to hear some questions from others as well. And I'll wait maybe a moment if there's any other questions or thoughts. All right, I'll ask another one then while people are thinking. So kind of following up on everything that's been said, do you have any tips or tricks for initiating these sorts of collaborations? I know Dr. Strand talked about his email rules, and Dr. Burnett also talked about how to grab attention in the email, but other tips or tricks for initiating these collaborations? How can you have clear expectations up front and get the responses that you want?
I think a key item is to ask what is needed as well. Sometimes we tend to, go off on like what excites us. Oh, I work on this, and then you go into the grass. But I think it's really important to also listen to the clinical side and ask what is an unmet need that needs to be addressed. Like that was a pivotal item for us to enter this realm of asymptomatic bacteriuria a few years back. Because like as a PhD scientist in the lab, I was focused on specific molecules and specific interactions in bacteria, but I had not considered, oh, this is what the clinician really wants to know about. So I think asking that question, in my opinion, is very important.
I just want to echo that. I totally agree. And that was part of the reason I went back for my medical training. I studied sperm chemotaxis when I was in grad school, so how sperm find eggs and interact with them. And then I started shadowing in an IVF clinic when we figured out our protein in frog was homologous to mammalian sperm binding proteins. And the first thing the reproductive endocrinologist I shadowed with said was, well, what's the point? You can just put the sperm directly into the egg. Like there's no need to know anything about these interactions. And so to Maria's point, knowing what the unmet needs are the most clinically relevant questions, like those are the things that are going to transform clinical practice and patient care. And it doesn't mean it's not worth knowing some of these odd nuances. It just can help create a project that's, probably in many cases more fundable, let's be real, because if it's a real problem, then it's probably a little bit easier to get funding for that kind of thing, but also more, more groundbreaking and something that's actually going to change how medicine is practiced. And at least for me, that was the very rewarding thing about having a medical practice is kind of seeing what unmet needs are there and then thinking about using basic science skills to address them. So I think PhDs can benefit from learning from MDs what's really needed in a field, just like Maria was saying, and MDs can benefit from all the PhD skills about how to actually do that and investigate it in a systematic fashion and understand the inherent pathophysiology of disease rather than trying, two different random drugs against one another or other strange things that MDs do as part of like clinical trials sometimes that aren't really necessarily founded in an understanding of molecular and cellular biology and physiology of disease.
So one thing that has worked for me over the years is just feeding them, like feeding the residents or feeding the fellows or feeding the faculty, like just take them to lunch. And, they're always hungry. They're always starving because they've been in surgery forever, since 7 a.m. So take them to lunch and let them eat and then just start talking about science. I have learned more about clinical practice over lunch, and I've seen more disgusting pictures that they show you of their surgeries over lunch than at any other point during seminars or anything like that. It's a really important aspect to any sort of relationship. And I have sat there and just listened because they want to talk too, right? They want to talk about the problems they have. And I've learned more about those clinical decision points that Lindsey was just referring to, and thought more deeply about how I could get involved in researching and coming up with a solution for those decisions that they have to make. We had a paper that came out, I think it was last year, that was driven by one of the surgeons, where he had said, PSA for BPH, PSA is really important in distinguishing between cancer and BPH. This is a critical decision point for surgeons. And so we wanted to know how PSA differed in different types of BPH and how it was driven, how it was driving decision making. And that project would never have happened if I were in charge of it. I would have never pursued it. But one of the surgeons kept on me, like, we really, really need to figure this out. And it took 2-3 years, but we ended up collecting enough specimens and publishing a paper on it. And he got abstracts out of it. That was one of the papers that was critical for his tenure and promotion. And that was something that we talked about probably 20 times over lunch. And it was slow and we couldn't get it going. And then finally, he pestered me to the point where I was like, all right, we're going to do this for you. And it turned out to be great. So I think one of the key things is just having lunch.
That's a great point. And or sorry, Dr. Knight. Go
just
ahead.
Quickly, talking about surgeons, you've got to read their mood as well. When they sometimes come into the office, you can see they're exhausted, and the last thing they want to hear from you is problems with the machine or something going on. So you have to choose your conversations carefully sometimes, because if they're exhausted, don't bother them. Maybe they just need to come in to escape the clinical office and they want to be in the research space for some R&R. So
we're basically like small children, so just try to decide if we're hungry or we're tired or what kind of things we need. Give us very direct, like short instructions, and we'll be great. So yeah. It's funny because Doug has mentioned more things about, I'm like, he's right. Oh my gosh, I didn't even have the insight to think about it from that perspective.
And just to again echo what Maria said, we can get lost in the weeds sometimes, and sometimes the surgeons don't want to hear all of that. So you need to think big picture. Kidney stone disease is very heterogeneous, so I've learned so much getting a bigger picture instead of just focusing on oxalate all the time. So that's really helpful to talk big picture with them.
And it's great to hear all this, because I think in our lab meetings, we've often found that having someone with clinical background there is really important. And a recent example, we had one of the new pediatric urology fellows in our lab meeting, and he casually mentioned bladder Botox, and a lot of the basic scientists started laughing because they'd never heard of that. But that led to a good discussion later on about urinary tract anatomy, and we were up on the whiteboard drawing after that talking about bladder Botox. So even those casual comments or casual interactions can really lead to learning and lead to understanding each other better. So Chris has a question that she put in the chat. Chris asks, sometimes the push for quick results for abstract deadlines, for example, is frustrating, especially when, as a scientist, I feel that more data or more time for analysis is needed. How does it help to discuss timelines and expectations up front? And it seems like most of my projects come up without much forethought or discussion, as she would like. Any comments on that?
One other thing that Doug didn't mention, surgeons are always like in a hurry about stuff. So many times medical trainees, abstracts mean lots of things for them. It means opportunities for funding later. It also sometimes means you get to go to the conference and have your department pay for it, which is like basically translates into time off work and a mini vacation. So sometimes we're very interested in getting abstracts for reasons that are not necessarily scientifically driven. And if there's deadlines that come up or we find out about it last minute, it's not necessarily always the first thing that's on our mind. So sometimes these things push a little bit faster. I would definitely have frank conversations upfront in advance and try to get things to people in advance. But I mean, I'm a scientist surgeon and sometimes end up with this weird mix of procrastinating and rushing at the same time. So I understand when things end up being last minute too. Expectations. And remember, a lot of clinical research, like non-lab research, people can write up abstracts in ridiculously short periods of time because they're doing a retrospective study where they just do an anonymous data poll and they can analyze the data that night and submit the abstract the next day. Or they're doing something, where we're going to propose to use this questionnaire or something that's based off of whatever. So many surgeon scientists that practice in clinical research are not used to the absolutely rigorous standards and the timelines that are involved in doing bench basic science work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, Chris. Sometimes it is frustrating if you don't know that one of your colleagues has scheduled to go to a meeting and they suddenly ask you for an abstract. So I think having those conversations early, you know, at the beginning of the year or whatnot, and just saying, hey, what meetings are you planning to go to? Do you need help from me? What kind of data are you wanting to publish? Yeah, that's a good point. And I think having those conversations early are important.
Yeah, I completely agree. We didn't do that at the beginning, and it really like took me by surprise when I got abstracts that had already been submitted. I had almost like a heart attack because, you know, we talk about like we're so almost over controlled on the PhD side. So like every control has to be perfect. So again, it's a balancing act of being in the getting a little closer to the middle. Now I ask up front, what meetings do you want to go to? What exactly would you like to present? What's your, you know, and then we figure out contributions ahead of time.
Along with that, I think authorship conversations should be early too, because I don't know. I've seen MD stuff where it's like, well, I got those samples, but then they don't realize that on the back end, taking them to lab and doing 50 million things on them and omics and all this other stuff actually is far more than just getting the samples. So I think it applies for all collaborations in general in my mind, is have conversations upfront and early about what expectations are and what authorship ideas are going to be. And then that way no one gets hurt feelings or unrealistic ideas.
Great. Any other questions in the chat or from any of the participants? Oh, here we go. So here's a question. Thank you to all the speakers. As an MSTP student, UW, or University of Washington, maybe, sorry. My question is regarding the role of MD PhDs in this partnership. What can MD PhDs do to facilitate collaborations between our MD and PhD colleagues instead of relying on each side to foster their own? How can we serve as bridges? So maybe Dr. Burnett, I'll pass that off to you first.
Introduce them to one another, right? So if you know someone who's on the clinical side doing XYZ and you're like, wow, you know, so-and-so over here does this, it might be a really great match. Those are, you know, send that email or group text or whatever it is, introducing people that you know share similar research interests, but are kind of on different ends of the spectrum with clinical and basic science, and hook them up to collaborate and hang out with one another. I do that even for people outside of my department. I'll be like, oh, did you know so-and-so works on this? You know, like, let me send an email to introduce. And I always appreciate it when people do the same for me, because, you know, they'll bring up, oh, are you familiar with so-and-so's work? And I'm like, can you just introduce me? And then that way it's less awkward if I bring up things or ask.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. The MD PhDs have been really helpful in my research and bridging particularly multidisciplinary research within the institution. It was MD PhDs that bridged my interaction with MDs and other MD PhDs in the Department of Nutrition, Department of Hepatology. It's a really good way. Where you could really help is, you know, helping other people grow their research to be more multidisciplinary. And that's what NIH wants. And so I think you guys could play a huge role.
We end up being matchmakers a little bit, and it's a very satisfying position to be in, at least for me. So, and then in the process, then you make your own weird connections for research that you might not necessarily initially expect. So.
Some of you talked about like jargon and language and things early on. And, you know, that makes sense even among scientists who are in different fields. Can you talk about that a little more? Some bad experiences maybe that you've had, or how being cognizant of that has been useful?
think I'm the one who mentioned it at the beginning because, again, my pedigree is in bacterial physiology. So the first person I met at Vanderbilt was actually Dr. Doug Clayton, who's a urologic surgeon in the pediatric side. And I just started going on about my 2 signaling proteins and how they modulate specific gene regulation. And then about 20 minutes into my monologue, I realized that he was glazing over. So that was the first time I realized that, oh, I really need to, if I want to have a collaboration with this important aspect of, that would help my research, I really need to distill why is it important that I'm so excited about this. And then he did the same thing because half the things he was telling me at the beginning was acronyms that I didn't even know. And I would go to like MSTP students and be like, what does that mean? Because I don't know. So I think really starting to identify where you lose the audience is a good start. At least it was a good start for me.
It was really eye-opening for me. I took this early career development course this summer, and I was with a bunch of infectious disease people because I wrote a project on UTIs, and I was the only clinician and definitely, the only one in working on this kind of thing with the translational relevance. We were reading each other's grants, and it became very obvious how much jargon was in there. They're like, what does this mean? And I'm like, well, what does that mean? So I think if you can kind of get it to that grant reviewer level where you've explained it enough that somebody who's intelligent can understand it, but not in a way that's overwhelming, it's more digestible. The elevator pitch, we started the course by doing these videos for one another that had to be no more than 3 minutes with what our ideas were for our grant and our research. So the elevator pitch was very useful from that perspective. And then writing a grant kind of forced me to think about, okay, I have to make this, understandable and digestible to somebody else. Because I do the same thing, Maria, I go right into, I'm like, oh, there's a signaling protein, there's this. And then if we do this, then it might do that. And people are like, what? It's gone. And I'm very excited about things and easily jump around, and I have to learn to slow down and like make things digestible to my audience. So it's a work in progress, but elevator pitch and think about it like you're writing or what you would say in a grant to a smart person that necessarily isn't an expert in your field.
Yeah, I have the same experience. The surgeons I interact with always say to me, before you start, give me the elevator pitch. They, stop it no more than 2 or 3 minutes and just see where you're at.
I promised my chair I would never show a Western blot at grand rounds.
It's okay. I just reviewed the paper and I was like, where is that Western blot? You can't just show me the like data quantification without the actual blot. So
big pictures. Like 1 picture per slide, no Western blots, no getting into the weeds, like everything is high level. And that's how I have been able to get their attention. I do things like single cell RNA sequencing. There's a lot of detail that's completely unnecessary for the surgeons that you want to get a piece of bladder from or whatever, like don't get caught in the weeds. One other rule I have is never bring up stuff in the hallway. So like John was saying, like when you're just walking past them, just say hi, like don't immediately get into whatever problems you have. So it is about managing the relationship and I try to be someone who brings success and good news to people who are always hearing bad news. So just, trying to manage that relationship in that way.
I've just another question. I know that John and Doug and Lindsey are in departments where there are clinical chairs. Maria, are you also in a department with a clinical chair? You are, okay.
Yes.
Because it's a different experience for scientists who are not in departments that are clinical.
In what way?
Just finding clinical collaborators for one thing.
Oh, tracking them down because you're not forced to be at the same departmental events and things.
And that's what I hear as a part of the CAIRIBU community. I hear from a lot of scientists who have no clue how to get together with a clinician. And I realize that that's a big chasm to cross. If you're not in a department that's already clinical, that's a separate problem. We should have a separate forum on that because I think that really is separate.
Chris, you can be very siloed. It's a big conversation here at UAB, and they're trying to push basic scientists or PhD scientists in clinical departments to have mentors outside the department that are PhDs. So, you know, you can facilitate them easing into the job or learning more about other people that might have similar interests. So it's a big push here at UAB. There needs to be a better job with mentorship structure. And
I would say, don't be afraid to reach out to clinicians that are outside your university that are involved in groups like this, right? And say, hey, do you know anybody at my university? And would you mind introducing me? Because the clinicians know one another. Like, I mean, we all applied for residency together. We all interviewed for residency together. Same thing with fellowship, or we know somebody that knows somebody. So there's a lot that we can do too to help facilitate those things. So, you know, never be afraid to reach out to the people that you do know through a community like this and ask them to help you find people that are a little bit more convenient for you.
The Vanderbilt PhD graduate program has an interesting program where they offer students the opportunity to be paired with a clinician and go to clinic with them. And I imagine other places are starting to do this as well. So there's a few people in related labs who go to clinic with, for example, Doug Clayton, who's one of our collaborators, a pediatric urologist. And so they can see what does it look like when a patient comes in with a urinary tract infection, or what does it look like when you're prescribing antibiotics for a urinary tract infection in our case. And so those students the PhD students who participate in that, I think have really taken away a lot from understanding what it looks like to see the diseases in clinical practice. And so that's something that maybe other schools are already doing, or other schools will start to consider.
Yeah, we have an observer program at UCSD, and since starting my lab, which has just been slightly over a year ago, I've had a large number of graduate students, because I'm the only person who's a clinician who's around in that lab space a lot, asked to shadow me. And my lab is in ortho. So, because I study pelvic floor muscles for a large chunk of my life. So I've had the most number of PhD people in more ortho focused world shadowing me in my urogynecology clinic, looking at, you know, pelvic floor muscle strength and things in patients. But I think any exposure to clinical practice and sort of how it works, even if it's not specifically related to your area of expertise, is useful. Just like I think any basic science exposure for MDs and medical students is very, very useful, even if it's not going to be something that they use in the future.
And what do you guys think about, I think, Doug, you said this, you know, going to clinical meetings. I hear a lot. I'm sort of in both worlds. I'm a clinician, I'm a dietitian scientist, but I mostly deal in the science sphere. But anyway, I hear from a lot of scientists that they don't want to go to the AUA anymore because there's not as much science there as they would like, or, you know, SUFA or whatever. And I'm always like, you know, that's a mistake, because you got to go at least for a little while and show your face. And I think, Doug, you mentioned this. Do you want to talk about how that's important, or how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I've been going to the AUA for a long time. And I go to meetings within the AUA that are clinically focused. Like there was a new Society of Benign Prostatic Disease that was started by my chair a couple of years ago, and it's basically, you know, 300 urologists and me in there. But I learned so much from seeing, you know, what they're trying to do, all the newest lasers. You know, it can be kind of boring as a scientist, but that's how you see what the critical decision points are for these surgeons and how we can get involved on the science side. So I think it's a huge missed opportunity that most PhDs don't go to these meetings. And I review a lot of grants. I see it in their grants. They just don't understand the clinical relevance of what they're working on. So for me, going to these meetings keeps me grounded to what matters to patients.
The other reality that I face in my field is all the reviewers of study section are MDs pretty much. And if you don't go out there and get to know them and build a reputation in those meetings, you're going to have a tough time.
And I think the CAIRIBU group has done a really, from my participation in the past year or so, it has done a really nice job, thanks to Chris and Jennifer and other folks, of allowing, you know, basic scientists and clinicians to attend the same meeting or attend events like this and talk about our science and talk about how we can work together even better. Well, we're about 5 minutes from the hour. I might summarize some of the key points that I was taking notes on, but if any of the panelists have final thoughts, I'll let you do that now.
I think the only other thing, I think we kind of touched on it. If early on in your career, if you have the opportunity to have two primary mentors, a PhD scientist with a good reputation and a physician scientist, if they're both NIH funded, even better. But that really gets you off to a good start.
That's exactly what I have set up for my K. I have one that's PhD NIH funded and one that's MD and also NIH funded. So it's been a magical combination. So
I didn't have that when I started and I failed miserably. And then I had it in my second postdoc and it just, you know, the rest is history.
Well, first of all, big thanks to all the panelists. I know Dr. Hadjifrangiskou already had to hop off, but I think we had a really great discussion about forming collaborations broadly between basic scientists and clinical researchers, and thinking about MD and PhD interactions more specifically. So I'd like to highlight and summarize some of the key takeaways that at least I took notes on. So one of the really common themes that I think that was mentioned multiple times was the language that we use to communicate, and thinking about, Dr. Hadjifrangiskou mentioned trying to understand where you lose the other audience, whether it's jargon or acronyms that aren't shared between the two audiences. And then also practicing your elevator pitch to briefly emphasize your research and try to get across your point very quickly to people who are busy in the clinical world. We also talked about establishing clear expectations up front, and how clear expectations up front can reduce some of the burdens or reduce some of the barriers that you might encounter during these collaborations. And then Dr. Hadjifrangiskou mentioned when forming these sorts of partnerships, it's often helpful to ask clinicians up front, what's an unmet need, or how can I help you? And that is often a way to start to form these partnerships. And then Dr. Strand talked about how enthusiastic, especially surgeons, are to get involved in research. And I think that goes to the point that for basic scientists, access to clinical samples immediately elevates your translational research impact. And so if you can partner with clinicians who have access to those clinical samples, that can be really impactful. And then finally, thinking about how we can attend similar meetings, whether that's within the same institution, like a lab meeting, or a seminar, and then also conferences that are outside of the institution. That's a great way to meet people and start to form these partnerships as well. So those were my kind of big takeaways. I know there's a survey in the chat, so I hope you can all fill that out. And thanks for doing this. Thanks for logging on.